Midnight, 1861. The moon hides behind thick clouds, leaving only darkness to shield a young woman as she crouches in the underbrush near a Virginia plantation. Her name is Elizabeth Harris, and tonight she is making the most dangerous decision of her life. Behind her lies everything she has ever known: brutal labor, constant surveillance, the denial of her humanity. Ahead lies uncertainty, danger, and the slim possibility of something she has only dreamed about: freedom. Her heart pounds so loudly she fears it will give her away. Dogs bark in the distance. She knows if she is caught, the punishment will be severe, possibly fatal. But staying means living as property, as something less than human, for the rest of her life. So Elizabeth takes a breath, whispers a prayer to a God she is not sure listens to people like her, and begins to run. This is the story of how a woman who was considered merchandise, who was bought and sold like livestock, became one of the most celebrated voices in American history. This is the story of Elizabeth Harris, the enslaved woman who escaped bondage and transformed herself into the most famous diva of her time. To understand Elizabeth's journey, we need to understand the world she was born into. The year is 1838, and Elizabeth comes into the world on a tobacco plantation in southern Virginia. Her mother, Sarah, works in the fields from sunrise to sunset, her hands calloused and bleeding from constant labor. Elizabeth's father is unknown, possibly the plantation owner, possibly another enslaved man, possibly someone passing through. It does not matter. Under the laws of the time, Elizabeth's status is determined by her mother. She is born enslaved, born property, born without rights or protections under the law. From her earliest memories, Elizabeth understands what it means to be owned. She watches as families are torn apart, children sold away from parents, husbands separated from wives. She sees people beaten for the smallest infractions, for talking back, for working too slowly, for daring to look a white person in the eye. She learns quickly to keep her head down, to work hard, to make herself as invisible as possible. But inside, a question grows. Why? Why are some people considered human and others considered things? Why is her life worth less than the livestock in the barn? Elizabeth's mother, Sarah, is the one who first plants the seeds of a different future. Late at night, when the day's work is finally done and they are alone in their small cabin, Sarah tells Elizabeth stories. Stories of Africa, the homeland Sarah's own mother spoke of, a place where their ancestors were free. Stories of brave people who had escaped, who had made it to the north where slavery was illegal. Stories of a railroad that was not made of tracks, but of courage, of people helping others find freedom. Sarah teaches Elizabeth something dangerous: hope. She teaches her to read, using a tattered Bible she has managed to hide. Reading is forbidden for enslaved people, punishable by severe beating or worse. But Sarah believes that knowledge is power, that if Elizabeth can read, she can imagine a world beyond the plantation. Every night, by the dim light of a single candle, Elizabeth learns her letters, practices words, begins to see that there is a bigger world beyond the fields of tobacco. When Elizabeth is 10 years old, her mother dies. The official cause is listed as illness, but Elizabeth knows better. Her mother died of exhaustion, of malnutrition, of a body worn out by decades of brutal labor. Elizabeth is devastated, but she makes a promise to her mother's memory. She will not give up. She will survive, and somehow, some way, she will be free. After Sarah's death, Elizabeth is moved to work in the main house, serving the plantation owner's family. This is considered a privilege, lighter work than the fields, but it comes with its own horrors. Elizabeth is constantly watched, constantly at the beck and call of people who treat her like a piece of furniture. She serves meals, cleans rooms, tends to the needs of the family, and is expected to be grateful for the opportunity. The plantation owner's wife, Mistress Caroline, is particularly cruel. She takes pleasure in finding fault with Elizabeth's work, in humiliating her in front of guests, in reminding her constantly that she is nothing, that she is lucky to even be alive. But working in the house gives Elizabeth something valuable: information. She overhears conversations about the growing tensions between North and South, about abolitionists who want to end slavery, about the possibility of war. She hears whispered rumors of the Underground Railroad, the network of people who help enslaved individuals escape to freedom. She learns the names of conductors, safe houses, routes. She files all of this information away, waiting for the right moment. Elizabeth also discovers something else about herself during these years. She has an extraordinary voice. One day, while cleaning the parlor, she begins to hum a melody her mother used to sing. Mistress Caroline's daughter, a young woman named Margaret, hears her and is transfixed. She demands that Elizabeth sing properly. Elizabeth, terrified of punishment but unable to refuse, sings. Her voice fills the room, clear and powerful and achingly beautiful. Margaret is so impressed that she insists Elizabeth sing for guests when they visit the plantation. This becomes one of Elizabeth's duties: to perform, to entertain, to be displayed like a prized possession. If you're finding Elizabeth's story as compelling as we hope, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear stories of courage and transformation. Your support helps us bring more forgotten histories to light, and it ensures that voices like Elizabeth's are never silenced. Now let's continue with how Elizabeth planned her impossible escape. For Elizabeth, singing becomes both a burden and a gift. It is a burden because it reminds her that even her talents, even the most personal expression of her soul, are owned by others. But it is also a gift because it connects her to something beyond her circumstances. When she sings the spirituals her mother taught her, she feels close to Sarah, feels connected to a heritage of resistance and survival. And she begins to dream. What if she could sing for herself? What if she could use her voice not to entertain her oppressors, but to tell her own story? The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 changes everything. The plantation owner and his sons join the Confederate Army, leaving the plantation in the hands of Mistress Caroline and an overseer. With fewer people to maintain control, there is slightly more chaos, slightly more opportunity. Elizabeth begins to plan in earnest. She makes contact with other enslaved people on neighboring plantations, shares information, tries to find out who can be trusted. She learns about a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a free black man named Samuel who operates in the area, helping people escape to the north. Elizabeth knows the risks. If she is caught attempting to escape, she will be made an example of. She will be beaten publicly, possibly sold to a plantation further south, where conditions are even worse, or killed outright. But she also knows she cannot spend the rest of her life as property. She is 23 years old, and she has never made a single free choice in her life. Every moment, every action, every word has been dictated by others. The thought of dying as she lived, owned, and controlled is unbearable. So she makes her decision. She will run. She chooses a night in late autumn when she knows the household will be distracted. There is a gathering planned, and Mistress Caroline will be entertaining guests, which means most of the overseers will be focused on serving and surveillance in the main house. Elizabeth packs almost nothing: a small bag with a spare dress, the Bible her mother gave her, and a piece of bread she has managed to save. She has memorized the directions Samuel gave her, knows which landmarks to look for, which farms might offer shelter, and which to avoid at all costs. As night falls and the gathering in the main house grows louder, Elizabeth slips away from the servants' quarters. Her hands are shaking, her breath comes in short gasps, but she forces herself to move. She crosses the yard silently, avoiding the main paths, staying in the shadows. Every sound makes her freeze. A branch snapping, an animal rustling in the underbrush, the distant bark of dogs. She reaches the edge of the plantation and pauses, looking back one last time at the only home she has ever known. It is not really a home, she reminds herself. It is a prison, and she is breaking free. Elizabeth runs. She runs through fields and forests, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. She wades through a cold stream to throw off any dogs that might be sent after her. She keeps the North Star in sight when the clouds part, using it as her guide just as her mother taught her. By dawn, she has put several miles between herself and the plantation, but she knows this is just the beginning. The real danger is ahead. The first few days of Elizabeth's escape are a blur of fear, exhaustion, and determination. She travels only at night, hiding during the day in barns, hollow trees, or thick brush. She avoids roads and towns, sticking to forests and fields where she is less likely to be seen. Hunger gnaws at her constantly. The bread she brought is gone after the first day, and she survives on whatever she can forage. Wild berries, nuts, water from streams. She's always cold, always terrified, always listening for the sound of pursuers. On the third night, she encounters her first real test. She comes upon a farm that Samuel had told her about, a place that is supposed to be safe, but approaching any structure is terrifying. What if the information was wrong? What if the people have been discovered and are under surveillance? Elizabeth watches the farmhouse from a distance for hours, trying to decide what to do. Finally, driven by desperation and exhaustion, she approaches and knocks softly on the door. An older white woman opens it, her face suspicious. Elizabeth whispers the code phrase Samuel taught her, "A friend with friends." The woman's expression changes immediately. She pulls Elizabeth inside, feeds her, lets her rest for a few hours, and then sends her on her way before dawn with directions to the next safe house. This pattern repeats over the following weeks. Elizabeth moves from safe house to safe house, helped by an incredible network of people, both black and white, who risk their own freedom and lives to assist fugitives. She meets Quakers who oppose slavery on religious grounds, free black families who remember their own escapes, and even some white farmers who simply believe the institution is wrong. But not every encounter is friendly. One night, while sleeping in a barn, Elizabeth is nearly discovered by the property owner. She hides in a hayloft, barely breathing, as the man searches below with a lantern. He is muttering about fugitives, about how he will be rewarded handsomely if he catches one. Elizabeth's heart pounds so hard she thinks it will give her away. After what feels like hours, the man finally leaves, and Elizabeth waits until dawn before fleeing. She learns that paranoia and constant vigilance are the price of survival. Elizabeth also encounters other fugitives during her journey. One night at a safe house, she meets a man named James, who escaped from a plantation in North Carolina. They travel together for a few days, finding strength in shared experience. James tells her about his wife and children, who were sold away from him years ago. He's heading north in the hope that he might somehow find them, though he knows the chances are slim. Elizabeth tells him about her mother, about the promise she made. They encourage each other, share what little food they have, and keep each other alert during the dangerous nighttime travels. But after a close call with a group of slave catchers, they decide to separate, reasoning that two people together are easier to spot than individuals. Elizabeth never learns what happened to James, but she carries his story with her, a reminder that she is not alone in this fight. As Elizabeth gets further north, the landscape begins to change. The forests are different, the climate colder. She starts to see signs of civilization, small towns, and eventually larger cities. But with civilization comes new danger. More people means more chances to be recognized, more opportunity for someone to report her for a reward. Slave catchers operate in northern states too, capturing fugitives and returning them south under the Fugitive Slave Act. Elizabeth learns to move through towns quickly, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact. She acquires used clothing from sympathizers, trying to look like a free woman rather than a fugitive. After nearly 2 months of travel, Elizabeth finally crosses into Pennsylvania, a free state. The moment is overwhelming. She has made it. She is no longer legally property, but she does not feel entirely safe. The Fugitive Slave Act means she can still be captured and returned. True safety, she is told, lies in Canada or in cities with strong abolitionist communities where people will actively protect her. Elizabeth decides to head to Philadelphia, which she has heard has a large, free black community and many supporters of the abolitionist cause. Philadelphia in 1861 is a revelation for Elizabeth. For the first time in her life, she sees black people living freely, owning businesses, walking the streets without fear of being whipped or sold. She sees black children attending schools. She sees black families living in their own homes. It is overwhelming and beautiful and makes her realize just how much has been stolen from her. Elizabeth finds shelter with a family active in the abolitionist movement, and they help her begin to build a new life. But freedom comes with its own challenges. Elizabeth has no money, no formal education beyond what her mother taught her in secret, and no documentation of her existence. She is, legally and practically, starting from nothing. She takes work as a seamstress, then as a domestic worker for a wealthy abolitionist family, the Baxters. The work is hard, but it is paid work, and she is treated with basic respect. It is more than she has ever had. We're now deep into Elizabeth's transformation from fugitive to free woman. And if you're moved by her courage, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share this video with your community. Stories like Elizabeth's remind us that freedom is never given. It is taken, fought for, and defended. Your support ensures we can keep telling these stories. Now let's see how Elizabeth discovered her true calling. One evening, while working for the Baxter family, Elizabeth is in the kitchen preparing dinner when she begins to sing softly to herself, one of the spirituals from her childhood. Mrs. Baxter, passing through the kitchen, stops in her tracks. She asks Elizabeth to sing more, and Elizabeth, hesitant but compliant, does. Mrs. Baxter is stunned. She has attended concerts, heard trained singers, but there is something raw and powerful about Elizabeth's voice that moves her deeply. Mrs. Baxter asks Elizabeth if she has ever considered singing professionally. The question seems absurd to Elizabeth. She is a fugitive, a former enslaved person with no formal training. Who would want to hear her sing? But Mrs. Baxter is insistent. She has connections in the abolitionist community, including people involved in the arts. She believes Elizabeth's voice could be used not just for entertainment, but as a tool for the cause, a way to move people's hearts and minds about the evils of slavery. With Mrs. Baxter's help, Elizabeth begins to receive vocal training. A sympathetic music teacher, a German immigrant named Herr Schmidt, agrees to work with Elizabeth for free. He is amazed by her natural talent and works to refine her technique while preserving the emotional authenticity that makes her voice so compelling. For Elizabeth, these lessons are transformative. For the first time in her life, she is learning something not because she is forced to, but because she wants to. She is developing a skill that belongs to her alone, that cannot be taken away. Over the following months, Elizabeth's confidence grows. She begins performing at small abolitionist gatherings, singing spirituals and hymns. Her performances are powerful, not just because of her technical skill, but because of the authenticity of her experience. When she sings about longing for freedom, about the pain of bondage, about faith in the face of oppression, every word carries the weight of lived truth. Word of Elizabeth's talent begins to spread. Abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison hear about her and invite her to perform at larger events. Elizabeth is terrified at first. Standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, many of them white, feels dangerous. She still carries the trauma of being constantly surveilled and controlled, but she also recognizes the opportunity. This is a chance to tell her story, to make people understand what slavery truly means, to use her voice for something bigger than herself. Elizabeth's first major public performance is at an abolitionist rally in Boston in 1862. The venue is packed, filled with activists, sympathizers, and curious onlookers. Elizabeth steps onto the stage, her legs shaking, her heart racing. She looks out at the sea of faces and feels a moment of panic. But then she thinks of her mother, of the promise she made, of all the people still enslaved, and she begins to sing. The song she chooses is "Go Down, Moses," a spiritual that tells the story of liberation, of deliverance from bondage. Her voice rises, powerful and clear, filling every corner of the hall. The audience is transfixed. Many are moved to tears. When she finishes, there is a moment of stunned silence, and then the hall erupts in applause. People rise to their feet, cheering, crying, demanding more. Elizabeth sings again and again, each song more powerful than the last. After the performance, people line up to speak with her, to thank her, to hear more of her story. Prominent abolitionists tell her that her voice is a weapon, that she has the power to change hearts and minds. Elizabeth realizes that she has found her purpose. She will use her voice to fight back against the system that tried to destroy her. Over the next few years, Elizabeth becomes one of the most sought-after performers in the abolitionist movement. She travels across the northern states and even to Canada, performing at rallies, churches, and concert halls. Her repertoire expands to include not just spirituals, but also classical pieces, folk songs, and original compositions. She works with poets and composers who write pieces specifically for her, songs that tell the stories of enslaved people, that celebrate resistance and resilience. Elizabeth also begins to speak publicly about her experiences. At first, this is difficult. Revisiting the trauma of her past, exposing her pain to strangers, feels like opening old wounds. But she realizes that her testimony is powerful, that hearing directly from someone who survived slavery makes the cause real and urgent for audiences who might otherwise see it as an abstract political issue. She describes the brutality she witnessed, the families torn apart, the constant dehumanization. She talks about her escape, about the terrifying journey, about the people who helped her, and she always ends with a call to action. This is happening now, she tells audiences. While we sit in this comfortable hall, people are being beaten, worked to death, denied their humanity. What are you going to do about it? Her speeches are powerful and controversial. Some people are moved to join the abolitionist cause, to donate money, to support the Underground Railroad. Others are uncomfortable, accusing her of exaggerating or of being too political. There are even threats against her life. Pro-slavery sympathizers see her as dangerous, a voice that needs to be silenced. Elizabeth receives letters threatening violence, warning her to stop speaking out, but she refuses to be intimidated. She has already survived the worst they could do to her. She is not going to stop now. As the Civil War progresses and the Union begins to gain ground, Elizabeth's work takes on new dimensions. She performs for Union soldiers, for newly freed people in contraband camps, for communities trying to rebuild in the aftermath of battles. She sees firsthand the devastating human cost of the war, but she also sees hope. She sees enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, claiming their freedom. She sees black men enlisting in the Union Army, fighting for their own liberation. She sees the beginning of a new world, one where she and people like her might truly be free. When the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in 1863, Elizabeth performs at a massive celebration in Boston. She stands on stage and sings the Battle Hymn of the Republic. her voice ringing out with hope and defiance. The audience sings along, and for a moment it feels like anything is possible. But Elizabeth knows the fight is not over. Legal emancipation is just the beginning. The real work of building a just society, of ensuring that freedom means something more than just the absence of chains, lies ahead. After the war ends in 1865, Elizabeth faces new questions about her future. The abolitionist movement, which has been her home and her purpose for years, is evolving. Some activists turn their attention to other causes, like women's suffrage. Others focus on Reconstruction, the effort to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society. Elizabeth is torn. Part of her wants to rest, to finally build a quiet life after years of constant travel and activism. But she also knows that her work is not done. Formerly enslaved people are facing new challenges. Violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, discriminatory laws known as black codes, economic exploitation through sharecropping systems that are barely different from slavery. Elizabeth decides to continue using her platform. She performs to raise money for schools, for formerly enslaved people, for legal defense funds, for communities rebuilding after the devastation of war. She also begins to travel internationally, performing in Europe, where there is significant interest in American events and strong anti-slavery sentiment. Her performances in London, Paris, and Berlin are triumphs. European audiences are fascinated by her story and her talent, and she receives critical acclaim. She is compared to the great opera singers of the age, praised for both her technical skill and the emotional depth of her performances. But even as Elizabeth achieves fame and success, she carries the weight of her past. She suffers from nightmares, reliving the trauma of her time in bondage and her harrowing escape. She struggles with the feeling that she has abandoned those she left behind, even though she knows intellectually that her escape and her work have helped countless others. She grapples with guilt that she is living comfortably while so many formerly enslaved people are still struggling. These internal battles never fully go away. Elizabeth also faces the challenges of being a black woman in a society that, despite legal emancipation, remains deeply racist. Even in the North, even in progressive circles, she encounters prejudice and discrimination. Hotels refuse her service, venues try to segregate audiences for her performances, critics sometimes focus on her race rather than her talent. Elizabeth navigates these challenges with a combination of grace and strategic confrontation. She refuses to perform at segregated venues, uses her platform to call out discrimination, and allies herself with other activists fighting for full equality. Elizabeth's personal life during these years is complex. She has relationships, some romantic, some platonic, with people she meets through her work. She forms deep bonds with fellow activists, with musicians, with formerly enslaved people she helps along the way. But she never marries, never settles into a traditional domestic life. Some historians speculate about why. Perhaps the trauma of her past made it difficult to form intimate relationships. Perhaps she simply preferred her independence. Perhaps she was protecting herself and any potential partner from the dangers that came with being associated with her. Elizabeth herself rarely spoke publicly about her private life, preferring to keep that part of herself separate from her public persona. What is clear is that she built a chosen family, a community of people who supported her and whom she supported in return. She used her earnings to help fund education for black children, to support elderly, formerly enslaved people who had no family, to bail out activists who had been arrested. She lived modestly despite her fame, channeling most of her resources back into the community. If we've made it this far together through Elizabeth's extraordinary journey, it's time for one final call to action. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with everyone you know. Elizabeth's story is a testament to the power of the human spirit, and the more people who hear it, the more we honor her legacy and continue the work she started. Now let's bring her story home. By the 1870s, Elizabeth Harris is one of the most famous black performers in America and Europe. She has sung for presidents, for foreign dignitaries, for thousands of ordinary people. Her voice is recognized instantly, her story widely known. She is an icon, a symbol of triumph over oppression. But Elizabeth remains grounded. She continues to speak honestly about the ongoing struggles facing Black Americans. During the period of Reconstruction and then its betrayal through the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended federal protection for formerly enslaved people in the South, Elizabeth is vocal in her criticism. She uses her concerts and speaking engagements to draw attention to the violence and discrimination that continue despite legal freedom. She performs benefit concerts for victims of racist attacks, for families whose loved ones have been lynched, for communities fighting back against oppression. She collaborates with journalists to document these atrocities, using her fame to ensure that these stories reach national and international audiences. Elizabeth also becomes involved in the women's suffrage movement, recognizing the connections between different forms of oppression. She works with activists like Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth, though she's sometimes frustrated by the racism she encounters even within progressive movements. Some white suffragists are willing to sacrifice black women's rights in pursuit of their own goals, or they fail to recognize the unique challenges facing women of color. Elizabeth insists that true equality must include everyone, that liberation cannot be selective. She delivers speeches arguing that the fight for women's rights and the fight for racial justice are inseparable, that both must be pursued simultaneously. This stance sometimes puts her at odds with both movements, but Elizabeth is unwavering in her principles. She has learned from hard experience that partial freedom is not freedom at all, that any system that oppresses any group of people is unjust. As Elizabeth enters her 50s, her health begins to decline. Decades of travel, the physical demands of constant performing, and the toll of trauma and stress have worn down her body. She develops respiratory problems, likely worsened by the poor living conditions of her childhood and the stress of her escape. She begins to perform less frequently, focusing more on writing and mentoring younger performers. Elizabeth writes an autobiography, published in 1882, titled From Bondage to Voice, The Life of Elizabeth Harris. The book is remarkable for its unflinching honesty. Elizabeth describes the brutality of slavery in detail, does not romanticize her escape, and is open about the ongoing challenges she faces. She also uses the book to reflect on the larger meaning of freedom, arguing that true liberation requires not just legal rights, but also economic opportunity, education, dignity, and the ability to define one's own life. The autobiography is both a commercial and critical success, becoming required reading in many abolitionist households and schools. Elizabeth also establishes a school for young black performers, using her own home in Philadelphia as the initial location. She wants to pass on what she has learned to help the next generation develop their talents and their voices. She teaches music, of course, but also public speaking, history, and what she calls the politics of performance. How to use one's platform responsibly, how to navigate a world that will try to exploit or silence you, how to maintain one's integrity in the face of pressure. Many of her students go on to successful careers, and they credit Elizabeth not just with teaching them technique, but with giving them the confidence to believe they deserve to be heard. In her final years, Elizabeth continues to work, though at a slower pace. She gives occasional performances, always to benefit causes she believes in. She writes articles and letters to newspapers, commenting on current events and always pushing for greater justice and equality. Elizabeth Harris dies in 1894 at the age of 56. The official cause of death is pneumonia, but those close to her know that her body had simply been through too much. The announcement of her death is front-page news in papers across the country. Obituaries describe her as one of the greatest singers of her generation and a tireless advocate for justice. Her funeral in Philadelphia is attended by thousands of people. Formerly enslaved people, activists, musicians, politicians, and ordinary citizens come to pay their respects. The service includes performances of her favorite spirituals, sung by the students she taught. Speaker after speaker rises to talk about what Elizabeth meant to them, how her voice and her courage had changed their lives. Frederick Douglass, himself elderly by this time, delivers a eulogy in which he calls Elizabeth a voice that could not be silenced, a spirit that could not be broken, a light that showed us what freedom truly means. Elizabeth is buried in a cemetery for free Black Americans in Philadelphia. Her gravestone, paid for by public subscription, reads simply, Elizabeth Harris, 1838 to 1894. She sang freedom into being. In the years following her death, Elizabeth's legacy takes many forms. Her autobiography continues to be read. Her recordings, some of the earliest made on the new phonograph technology, are preserved and shared. Songs she popularized remain part of the American musical canon. Schools and theaters are named in her honor. But perhaps her most important legacy is intangible. Elizabeth proved that the journey from bondage to freedom, from being considered property to being celebrated as an artist, was possible. She showed that survival itself could be an act of resistance, and that reclaiming one's voice was a revolutionary act. She demonstrated that talent and determination could overcome even the most oppressive systems, though she was always clear that individual success did not erase the need for systemic change. In the decades after her death, as the full horror of slavery becomes clearer to new generations, as the ongoing struggle for civil rights continues, Elizabeth Harris's story is told and retold. Sometimes it is simplified, turned into an inspirational tale that glosses over the trauma and focuses only on the triumph. But for those who read her own words, who listen to her recordings, who study her life carefully, the full complexity remains. Elizabeth was not a superhuman figure. She was a woman who endured unimaginable cruelty, who made difficult choices, who fought for her freedom and then dedicated her life to helping others find theirs. She struggled with trauma, with doubt, with exhaustion, but she never stopped fighting, never stopped using her voice, never stopped believing that a better world was possible. When we look at Elizabeth Harris from our vantage point more than a century later, her story resonates in powerful ways. We live in a world that is still grappling with the legacies of slavery, still fighting for true racial justice, still working to ensure that freedom means something more than just the absence of chains. Elizabeth's journey reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that every gain in freedom and justice has been fought for by real people who faced real risks. Her story challenges us to think about what freedom actually means. Is it just legal status, or does it require economic security, social respect, the ability to live without fear? Elizabeth insisted it was the latter, and her life was a testament to that belief. She also reminds us of the power of voice, both literally and metaphorically. Elizabeth used her singing voice to move people, to inspire them, to make them feel the weight of injustice. But she also used her voice in the broader sense. She spoke up, she told her story, she refused to be silenced or forgotten. In an era when formerly enslaved people were often expected to be grateful and quiet, Elizabeth was neither. She demanded that people listen, that they understand, that they act. That insistence on being heard, on controlling her own narrative, was as important as her musical talent. Today, Elizabeth Harris's story is part of the larger narrative of African American history, of the long struggle for freedom and equality that continues to this day. Her voice, preserved in early recordings, still has the power to move listeners. Her words, written in her autobiography and preserved in letters and speeches, still challenge us to think deeply about justice and human dignity. Her example still inspires activists, artists, and ordinary people who face their own struggles against oppression and exploitation. When we honor Elizabeth Harris, we honor not just her individual achievement, but the collective struggle of which she was a part. We honor her mother, Sarah, who risked everything to teach her to read. We honor the conductors of the Underground Railroad who helped her escape. We honor the abolitionists who supported her work. We honor the countless other enslaved people who never had the chance to tell their stories, whose voices were silenced by violence and oppression. Elizabeth carried all of their stories with her, and in doing so, ensured they would not be forgotten. Elizabeth's life also reminds us of the costs of oppression, the ways that trauma echoes across years and decades. She achieved remarkable success, but she never fully healed from what had been done to her. The nightmares never completely stopped. The fear never fully left her. And this is an important part of her legacy too, the recognition that surviving oppression is not the same as being unscathed by it, that resilience and trauma can coexist, that healing is a lifelong process, not a destination. Elizabeth was honest about this in a way that was unusual for her time and remains powerful today. She refused to present herself as having overcome everything, as being somehow immune to pain. She insisted on her full humanity, which meant acknowledging both her strength and her struggles. As we close this exploration of Elizabeth Harris's extraordinary life, we are left with questions that she herself asked and that remain relevant today. What does it truly mean to be free? How do we honor the struggles of those who came before us? What are our responsibilities to those who are still fighting for justice? Elizabeth's answer to these questions was clear. Freedom is not passive, it is active. It requires constant vigilance, constant work, constant courage. Honoring the past means learning from it, not just celebrating victories, but understanding the full context of struggle and sacrifice. And our responsibility to the present and future is to continue the fight, to use whatever platform we have, whatever voice we possess, to speak up for justice and human dignity. Elizabeth Harris, the enslaved woman who became a celebrated diva, lived these principles every day of her free life. She used her voice, her talent, her fame, and her resources in service of something larger than herself. She never forgot where she came from, never lost sight of those still struggling, and she showed us all what is possible when we refuse to accept injustice, when we claim our own power, when we insist on being fully human and fully free. Thank you for staying with us through this entire journey into Elizabeth Harris's life. If her story has moved you, if it has taught you something, if it has inspired you to think differently about history and justice, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people, and share it with your friends, your family, your community. Stories like Elizabeth's need to be told and retold, passed down through generations, so that we never forget the price of freedom or the power of one voice to change the world. Elizabeth sang freedom into being, and her song continues to this day. Every person who stands up against injustice, every voice that refuses to be silenced, every act of courage in the face of oppression is part of the same song Elizabeth sang. And it is a song that will not end until every person is truly free, until justice is not just an ideal, but a lived reality for all. Until next time, remember Elizabeth Harris. Remember her courage, her voice, her refusal to be anything less than fully human. And ask yourself, how will you use your own voice? What will your contribution be to the ongoing struggle for freedom and justice? The story is not over. It continues with us, with you, with every choice we make to either perpetuate injustice or to stand against it. Elizabeth showed us the way. Now it is up to us to keep walking that path, to keep singing that song of freedom until everyone can join the chorus.